Welcome, everyone. My name is Philip Mead. I'm the chief historian and curator of this Museum of the American Revolution. So pleased to see you all tonight for Friederike Baer's presentation on the Hessians. Scott Stevenson sends his regrets. He had intended to be here tonight hosting, but was unavailable. He may be watching from Zoom, so if you're out there, Scott, hello. I wanted to call your attention tonight to an important object that we actually have here in this room. This is a fragment of a Hessian mitre cap from the Fusiliers von Kniphausen of Hesse Castle. It was discovered among other fragments of these caps in the Delaware River in the early 20th century, and some historical research by Craig Nanos and others has pretty well established that it was lost when a troop transport went under in March of 1778 in the Delaware River. No one drowned. All of the soldiers on board survived, but obviously a bunch of their things stayed in the river. They were dredged up and are on display. Other pieces of that same material are on display in the core galleries. I wanted to also mention, before we get too far along, a couple of upcoming events. We have our Spirit of the American Revolution event on June 9th. There are limited tickets still available, so check the calendar part of the website. We'll be honoring Professor Henry Louis Gates of Harvard University that night. And on June 28th, our CEO, Scott Stevenson, will be having a conversation with the historical artist Don Traiani, who did the artwork that's in our temporary exhibit gallery, Patriots Gallery right now, an exhibit which will run through September 9th, Labor Day weekend. So make sure you tune in for the interview with Don about his art and his historical research and collecting. So tonight, we have the privilege of welcoming Friederike Baer, who is Associate Professor of History and Division Head for Arts and Humanities at Pennsylvania State University, Abington College. Her research focuses on the experience of German-speaking people in North America from the Revolutionary period to the late 19th century. Her publications prior to tonight include the monograph, The Trial of Friedrich Eberl, Language, Patriotism, and Citizenship in Philadelphia's German Community, 1790 to 1830, which was winner of the St. Paul's Biglerville Prize for the best book in Lutheran church history. And tonight, she is launching her book, Hessians, German Soldiers in the American Revolutionary War, which is, I think, destined to be a indispensable book for scholars and general students of the American Revolution. It plumbs an extraordinary number of previously unexamined primary sources, and it gives us a view of a community in this conflict that we've really only understood through a glass darkly, so to speak, but with a precision and clarity and humanity that actually is going to be very hard to beat as the definitive treatment for, I think, a very, very long time. Thank you very much, Dr. Baer, Professor Baer, for these contributions, and we're eager to hear your comments. First, I wanted to also introduce from Haverford Trust, which has supported these Read the Revolution programs, both the email publications that many of you get, but also these evenings. I wanted to introduce, representing Haverford for a few words, Rebecca Farnsworth, who is their Vice President and Institutional Portfolio Manager. So Rebecca, thank you very much for joining us here.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Phil. As Phil mentioned, my name is Becky Farnsworth, and I am delighted to be here representing the Haverford Trust Company. Haverford is an investment management firm located in Radnor. We have $13 billion in assets under management. At Haverford, I'm an institutional portfolio manager, which effectively means that I'm responsible for managing investment assets and serving as a trusted advisor to a number of our firm's nonprofit clients. I think we all feel very fortunate to live in a region that has such deep philanthropic roots, and Haverford has been committed to serving our nonprofit community since the firm's inception over 40 years ago. And the greatest joy of my job is building deep strategic partnerships with our nonprofit clients and amazing organizations like the Museum of the American Revolution, who do such important work in strengthening the fabric of our communities. And Haverford's been a longtime partner of the museum, and it's very much a pleasure of our organization to once again sponsor the incredible Read the Revolution speaker series here at the museum. And as the concluding speaker of this year's presentation program, we're all very much looking forward to hearing from Dr. Baer. So I'll just welcome all of you. Thank you very much for being here this evening, those in person and on Zoom. And I'll turn it back over to Phil to get things started. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, without further ado, Professor Baer, if you'd join me up here and give us your wisdom.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. I never thought I would be giving a lecture at the Museum of the American Revolution, and I'm just so happy to be here today. So good evening, whether you're joining us here in person or on Zoom, wherever you are. Thank you for being here. Thank you to Phil, Scott, the entire team. It's been a really wonderful experience working with you all to get this organized. And thanks, of course, also to the Haverford Trust for supporting the speaker series. I've had the pleasure of attending quite a few of them, and they're just really great experiences. And I hope this one will be a great experience for you as well. Let me just click to the first slide. So I would like to say a few general words about who they were, these thousands of troops whom we call Hessians, how they ended up in North America, and then I will give a few snapshots of their experiences over the course of the war. So I want to start with a brief introduction. In the 1770s and 1780s, as many as 40,000 German soldiers were hired to defend British imperial interests on 4 continents, in Europe, in India, in South Africa, and of course in America. The vast majority of them, at least 30,000, saw service in America. In August 1776, a German periodical, Die Deutsche Chronik, or the German Chronicle, noted optimistically that, quote, soon the English will have to thank the Germans a second time for the conquest of America. The editor was alluding to William Pitt's famous reference to Germany's role in the 7 Years' War a decade earlier, a war that had resulted in France ceding a large portion of its territorial possessions in North America, along with several Caribbean islands, to Britain. Earlier that year, 1776, Britain's Prime Minister Lord North had predicted that the hire of the German auxiliaries would bring the war, what he called a speedy resolution, without, quote, the further effusion of blood. Neither of these predictions, of course, as we know now, came true. The steady supply of Germans actually helped keep the war going for 7 more years. So before I continue, let me emphasize that by the late 1770s, early 1780s, 1/3 of the British regular army's strength in North America consisted of German auxiliaries. This was not an insignificant presence. Moreover, between the summer of 1776, when the first contingent set foot on American soil, and 1783, when the British Army evacuated the newly founded United States, members of the German Corps spent extended periods of time in location as dispersed and varied as Quebec and Nova Scotia in the north, and West Florida and Cuba in the south. Across this vast terrain, they participated in all major military campaigns and numerous less momentous skirmishes and military encounters. Some never saw battle. They spent their entire time in North America somewhere in garrison. Thousands died of disease, were killed in battle, or were captured by the enemy. Over the course of the war, a growing number also deserted. I put up this map here from West Point Military Academy, which has a great collection of maps like this, just to remind you of the sort of the major campaigns. The red are the British campaigns. As I mentioned, the Germans took part in all of them. I should point out they did not take part in the ones in the Great Lake regions. They also did not go into East Florida. They did, however, take part in a couple of campaigns that actually are not highlighted here, namely the occupation of Newport, Rhode Island, and also sailing all the way to Pensacola and then fighting against the Spanish on a number of forts along the Mississippi River. There were also troops up, as I mentioned, in Nova Scotia, which is not indicated here on this map. So how did they end up in America? In the spring of 1775, Britain faced the challenging task of raising a substantial military force that could be dispatched to America quickly. For various reasons, I don't want to go into detail, the king determined that he would not be able to raise sufficient number of troops at home or within the other parts of the empire, including North America. After his failure to hire 20,000 Russians, the king turned to several German states for support. French intelligence actually suggests that British efforts to hire Hessian troops may have commenced as early as fall 1774, before the war even started. At that time, this is a reminder, what is sometimes called the trade in soldiers was an acceptable form of revenue. Rulers used the income from hiring out military units to support their lifestyle, pay off territorial debt, and to fund projects that were designed to benefit their territories generally, such as construction of villages, hospitals, schools, or spas. Moreover, subsidy treaties should also be seen as political measures that allowed the rulers of smaller territories within the Holy Roman Empire to maintain a certain degree of power and influence, and in some cases preserve dynastic interests and gain protection from foreign powers. All of the major European powers, such as France, Russia, Prussia, and the United Provinces of the Netherlands, included foreign troops into their military forces. In fact, in the 18th century, the typical European army was a multinational force. Eventually, of course, we know 6 German territories, all within the Holy Roman Empire. Of course, there was no Germany at the time. The Holy Roman Empire consisted of hundreds of small territories and larger territories. 6 of them ultimately agreed to enter into subsidy treaties to hire out auxiliary troops in exchange for substantial payments. Hessen-Kassel and Hessen-Hanau, which I combined on the map here, the red, small territory of Waldeck, Braunschweig-Wolfenbüttel, Bayreuth, Ansbach, and Anhalt-Zerbst. Sorry, color a little bit difficult to see. But in any case, there are 6 territories. They rented out troops ranging from maybe around 1,200, ultimately total of 1,200 from the territory of Waldeck, to as many as 19 or 20,000 soldiers hired out by Hessen-Kassel. The very first treaties were signed in late 75. The first troops began their journey to America in February 76. I should also point out that these soldiers were not mercenaries. They are usually referred to as mercenaries, but they were not mercenaries. Mercenaries really are soldiers who fight in a foreign army or a foreign war for personal profit. These troops are considered auxiliaries. These are military units that were hired out by their respective rulers to assist Britain in its efforts to put down the American rebellion. Although the subsidy treaties varied somewhat, they agreed on the basics very quickly. The troops would serve on the same terms as the British soldiers. They could only serve in Europe and North America. This was very important to the rulers. Britain paid annual subsidies to the rulers during the time they were in British service and usually for a couple of years afterwards. Of course, no one knew how long the war would last. Britain would also pay for transport to and from America. It would cover individual pay, equipment, provisions, replacements, medical care, and so on. As you can probably imagine, keeping track of all of this was quite challenging and got even more complicated and confusing over the course of the war. For those of you who like spreadsheets, this is one from 1783. This is actually trying to tally up expenses and income and what was still owed to the Braunschweig troops that were in Canada at the time. It's on the eve of their evacuation and their return to Europe. And there are lots of records like these in the archives. And you have people, even then, it's hard for us to figure out what's going on. We have people there too who complain constantly, like, sorting out the finances, who gets paid for what, who is owed what money, who's paying, is it a British bank in London or in Germany or in America? It's very confusing. I do also want to point out that expenses such as rations and uniforms were commonly deducted from the soldiers' pay. So soldiers themselves were responsible for covering some of these expenses. The German units would be commanded by their own officers and subject to their own military law. They almost always served alongside British troops, with very rare exceptions. The overall commander was also always a British officer. Because the majority of these troops were supplied by the territories of Hessen-Kassel and Hessen-Hanau, the label Hessian has been used since the 1770s to describe all German troops in British service in North America, regardless of place of origin. And for this reason, I'm using the term in the title of my book. However, in the book itself, and also today, I use German when referring to the troops collectively, and Hessian when discussing Hessian units or individuals belonging to the Hessian Corps. After all, the subsidy troops and affiliated civilians never described themselves as Hessian unless they were actually from Hessian or belonged to a Hessian military unit. The troops were accompanied by hundreds of civilian employees and other camp followers, including medical personnel, chaplains, servants, laborers. To the army belonged also a significant number of women, including single women and also wives of soldiers who served in a range of essential roles, such as, for example, laundresses and maids who were employed in field hospitals. There was also a great number of children. So who were these auxiliaries? Well, none of the German rulers simply rented out their entire armies. The potentially long-term and even permanent loss of large numbers of young men would not only hurt the economy, not only hurt the territory economically, but it would also, of course, potentially make it vulnerable to foreign threats. In general, the regiments hired out to Britain consisted of a combination of experienced soldiers and new recruits, some of whom had probably never fired a gun before leaving for the war in America. For example, the 3rd Waldeck Regiment that I mentioned earlier consisted of roughly 670 men, typically at full strength. It consisted of around 200 men who were taken from 2 regiments at the time that were in Dutch service at the time. The other ones, about twice that number, had to be specially recruited for service in America. So Britain may have expected to get a trained and experienced military force, but this was only partially the case. It was fairly easy to fill the officer rank. The war presented them with an opportunity to advance their careers. All of the territories received large numbers of requests or applications, essentially, from officers as well as ambitious soldiers and veterans asking for appointments in the American Corps. The territories used a variety of conscription schemes to raise the troops, such as enrollment lists, for example, or requiring districts to raise a certain number of men. Regardless of the kind of scheme they employed, the territories were essentially looking for this same type of men to fill up the regiments. They had to be, ideally, physically and mentally fit to withstand demands of military service in America. They should be at least around 5 feet 4 inches tall. Ideally, they were single and if married, without children. All of these requirements, I should mention, were relaxed over the course of the war. It became increasingly difficult to make up for the losses. All of the territories used various exemptions that were designed to exclude certain men from military service. For example, only sons that expected to inherit property, property owners, laborers in essential industries such as mining. These men were not supposed to go in service abroad. Generally, recruiters were supposed to enlist foreigners, by which they meant non-natives to their territory where they were recruiting, or native men deemed expendable. And that means essentially men whose departure for America was regarded as having little or no economic disadvantages for the territory, or whose absence may have even been seen as beneficial for the local community. For example, in February 1776, an official from Braunschweig asked the Duke for permission to enlist a poor man who was serving time in prison for stealing wood from the ducal forests. That same month, a woman, Anne-Catherine Quidde, begged the Duke to enlist her son-in-law, whom she described as, quote, a disgusting, godless man, end of quote. She pleaded with him to, quote, free us from this evil man. And we have quite a few petitions like this in German archives. Drunkenness, laziness, those kind of things. It's sometimes wives, sometimes in-laws are like, can you please take him and send him to America? Ideally, of course, the men volunteered. But thick files in German archives document cases of young men who refused to report for mustering, potential recruits who escaped into foreign territories, recruits who deserted or mutinied, and families who pleaded with their ruler to exempt husbands and sons for a variety of reasons. Just because a man was deemed expendable by the territory, of course, did not mean that he was deemed expendable by their families. So a lot of even poor families, when the husband or son was gone, these families suffered even more economically. And so the poor families are very much affected by this, as you can probably imagine. The main objections when we read these petitions from parents, for example, or wives to exempt their husbands, the main objection appears to have been the prospect of serving in a foreign war on a distant continent against an enemy that had done them no harm. Military service itself was not the problem, it's sending these men to America, where many, of course, assumed they would never come back. Although Britain had hired German auxiliaries on multiple occasions since the 18th century, since the 17th century really, they had never served outside of Europe, so this was new. It is difficult to determine how many men were forced into service. The definition of forced might include difficult economic circumstances, for example, problems with relatives, trouble with the law, in addition to coercive tactics such as trickery or offers of food and alcohol. Parental and peer pressure appeals to the men's sense of patriotism, and love for their ruler also played important roles in compelling subjects to enlist. Many were undoubtedly, and we know this, impoverished rural folk who were forced to go by their circumstances or by the authorities. The German poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe recalled in 1821 that in 1775, and I quote, America used to be the El Dorado of people who found themselves in a difficult situation. However, there were also many reasons why a man from the Holy Roman Empire may have volunteered for service in America. I'm showing you here a recruiting certificate for a man in Braunschweig, from Braunschweig, who signed up. Johann Friedrich Hennig, he was a rope maker by trade, a Protestant. I've summarized here the basic information from this certificate. I don't know why he signed up. Maybe it was the bounty. I want to point out that he received 5 thaler, which at the time was quite generous. To put this into perspective, a servant's monthly wages at the time were maybe between 1 and 1.5 thaler. So 5 thaler is a pretty good amount of cash that he would get just for signing up. I also want to point out the date, 1782. This is a good reminder that Britain actively recruited Germans well into the, 1782, even into 1783. So conventional histories of the Revolutionary War are often more or less over with Yorktown. But focusing on the Germans reminds us, well, the war is not over at Yorktown, at least not from the British perspective. So we have large shipments of recruits that go to America as late as the fall of 1782. So recruits maybe went willingly or they volunteered for an opportunity to improve their economic situation. Some probably went to gain free passage to America. Maybe they planned to emigrate, and it kind of was a free ride. Some hoped to advance their military careers, study the American land and people, or they were in search of adventure. 22-year-old recruit Stefan Popp from Ansbach-Bayreuth recorded in his journal that many of the recruits around him were, and I quote, filled with grief and sorrow, while I, and those in my way of thinking, were enjoying the prospect of leaving our mother country for the new world. A few of these recruits, or people that signed up, were actually explorers and scientists who recorded their observations about the American land and the people in letters and journals. They studied fossils, collected cultural objects, and natural specimens. My 2 examples here is on the left, a very popular journal. It's called August Schlözer was an editor. It's called a Briefwechsel or a correspondence exchange of letters. He actually published a whole series of letters that he solicited from officers in America. It's like, send me letters that I can publish during the war. And here's an example of a series from Canada. On the right is a publication by David Schöpf. He was a scientist who was actually getting ready to go to India when he was presented with the opportunity to accompany the Ansbach-Bayreuth troops to America as a regimental surgeon. He signed up, and not only that, he decided to remain in America for 2 additional years after the conclusion of the war to study the land of the people. He was disappointed that he'd only seen Little York, as he called New York, Little Rhode Island, and the narrow city district of Philadelphia. So he wanted to go out, and that's what he did after 1783. He eventually published a travel narrative. He penned several letters that were published in Germany during the war, and numerous works on natural history topics. And again, here's an example. These individuals did so privately because they were interested in studying this strange land, but they also often did per their rulers or an editor's request, as in the case of Schlözer. In 1779, for example, General Wilhelm von Knyphausen, the commander of the Hessian troops, directed all Hessian regiments on behalf of the Landgraf, the ruler of Hessen, to collect what he called rarities, such as Native American clothing and equipment, and he ordered the quartermasters to maintain journals that detailed, as he put it, each and every event pertaining to their regiments. A receipt in the archives in Kassel indicates that Knyphausen himself brought back from America a sugar cane and a pouch with crystals as a gift for the famous naturalist Georg Forster, who was a professor at the Collegium Carolinum in Kassel at the time. So in all these kind of accounts, published, circulated amongst friends, or published during and after the war, helped broaden the knowledge of North America among German-speaking Europeans. To some extent, these soldiers really acted almost like foreign correspondents. And they wrote these things that were published throughout the war in various German territories. So in my book, I talk a little bit about the logistics, really, of getting these troops to America. I'm going to not go into great detail here. Just want to mention, of course, that they were taken to ports in Germany or the Netherlands. They were mustered there into British service. That's really when their role in British service officially started. They boarded vessels that took them to England and then from there to America. German records describe the ocean crossing as a very frightening experience. This is new to Germany. It's not a seafaring country, really. So for them, they had maybe been on riverboats, but ocean crossing for them was a new experience, and it was generally pretty scary. So the sighting of land offered significant relief. Diaries and journals described the crossing in great detail. The Braunschweig surgeon Julius Friedrich Basmus, as he put it in his own diary, kept thinking of Columbus as his vessel was sailing toward the Canadian coast in early summer of '76. He felt as though the German troops were discovering a new world. That's how he put it. And to them, I would say it was a new world indeed. Luise Wiedemann, the sister of the physician Christian Friedrich Michaelis, who served in the Hessian Corps as a physician, noted later that the journey to America at the time was almost as adventurous as going to the moon. In fact, when the first contingents of German troops were venturing across the Atlantic in the spring of '76, the average German probably did not know much about the Western Hemisphere, especially North America, and they knew even less about the war they were about to enter. In addition, important to note as well, the vast majority of the German troops had no knowledge of English when they set out for America, and many struggled to acquire even a basic command of it after their arrival. The German troops thus had to get used to fighting in an unfamiliar terrain along soldiers and under commanders, and against an enemy they did not necessarily understand. Major Karl Leopold Bauermeister of the Hanau Corps captured the sense of frustration in the very first entry of his journal. He wrote, "It was twice the work to fight a war with an incomprehensible friend and rebellious enemy." The first transport carrying German troops arrived in the summer of 1776. Actually, the first ones arrived in Canada, and then shortly thereafter, troops arrived in New York. What were the impressions of this land? Well, many Germans recorded detailed descriptions of the New York regions. Their view of what they initially saw as representing all of America was very favorable. The Americans appeared to be enjoying a very high standard of living. An ordinary Long Island farmer, one observer mentioned, appeared to be living as well as an aristocrat in Hessen. Indeed, one officer noted, if one put an American farmhouse next to the house of a noble family in Hessen, it would be challenging to tell the difference. One reason for this prosperity was the richness of the land itself. The Germans described the landscape, including the farmland, as exceptionally abundant and fertile. And I choose this image here, a map, because we have to remember, of course, that New York, the Staten Island, Long Island, this is rural. There are forests, this is green, it's not built up the way it is today. So obviously when these troops arrived, they saw country, and what they described as rolling hills, lush forests, fresh springs. There was an abundance of wheat, corn, other grains. There were many orchards, chestnuts, peaches, cherries, apples, pears, plums, apricots, and other fruit. The livestock was well nourished, the farms neatly kept. Long Island was described as the garden of all of North America. The Germans' impression of New York City was very positive as well. They admired its wide streets, beautiful churches, stately college. Sadly, this prosperity seemed to have corrupted the inhabitants. Indeed, the view of the land was so favorable that many of the German observers speculated that the reason for the rebellion could not possibly be oppression by the mother country, as the Americans were claiming. From their perspective, the colonies had little reason to complain. If anything, many had become lazy and decadent. One Lieutenant Henkelmann remarked in a letter to Kassel that the white inhabitants of New Jersey lived, quote, like pigs. They drank and ate several meals a day. The women spent their time waiting for tea, decorating their homes. The evident abundance of goods also encouraged the Americans to be wasteful with what to the Germans were valuable resources such as firewood, for example. Most Germans could not fathom why such a prosperous people would take up arms against a benevolent king under whose watch they had obviously done so well. The Germans concluded that the rebellion must have been the work of a few conspirators of selfish and sinister intentions who were deluding the American people into believing that they were struggling for liberty from oppression. A few evil men, committeemen, one observer called them, were conspiring to make themselves masters of the people under the pretense of fighting for freedom. From the perspective of the Germans, the white population was able to enjoy such a high standard of living in part because they depended on the labor of black people. German records from the period use the term Mohren or Mohren, and which translates as Moors, when referring to black men, women, and children. In fact, one Hessian chaplain wrote, "If there was a people in America that was longing for liberty," as he put it, it would be these, quote, poor blacks. The evident wealth of the New York region contrasted starkly with the desolation that the rebels had brought to their own country. Without the British oversight and protection, so it seemed, the nation's prosperity was rapidly declining. When the first German troops landed in North America, the war, of course, had been going on for more than 1 year. They were shocked by the extent of destruction that had been done by two civilian properties in the New York region. They found entire villages abandoned, homes plundered, cattle killed, fields burned. Not surprisingly, the population that was hit hardest were the people who were, or were suspected to be, loyal to the crown. The Americans' treatment of the civilian population helped create an image of the Americans as an undisciplined and unprincipled people. This experience, by the way, also helps explain why the German troops initially saw themselves as liberators rather than occupiers, and they were confused when the people did not treat them accordingly. What became known as the Great Fire of New York in September 76, shortly after the arrival of the British and Hessian troops, reinforced the Germans' views of the Americans as vengeful fanatics. The fire consumed as many as a quarter of the city's buildings. The Hessians were convinced that it had been set by the rebels, and they regarded this event as powerful evidence for their irrational determination to destroy their own country rather than letting it thrive under British rule. The Hessian officer, Andreas Wiederhold, was shocked that the, quote, evil and disobedient rebels were deliberately destroying what he described as their blessed land and habitations. Another officer wrote, "The evil sentiments of this nation are indescribable," as he surveyed the destruction of New York. They were destroying the nicest regions in the entire world. Over the next few years, the view of a fanatical enemy was reinforced over and over again as German troops saw burned and pillaged homes, fields, and forests in other regions, including Maryland and Pennsylvania, the Carolinas, Virginia, and Georgia. Ultimately, these experiences, combined with military setbacks, also raised doubts in the minds of German soldiers whether this enemy could be crushed, given their stubborn determination to defeat Britain. They were obviously willing to sacrifice everything in defense of their cause, and as time went on, there was no indication that this resistance was diminishing. Initially, however, the Germans did not have much respect for the Americans as a worthy enemy. Of course, again, many of the German soldiers themselves were young men who had been recruited specifically for the war in America. They were not necessarily more experienced in warfare than their American counterparts. Certainly, most of them had never participated in a battle before. However, from the perspective of someone belonging to a highly hierarchical and disciplined army that stressed the neat and orderly appearance of all its members, from private to general, the Americans did not even look like soldiers. Here's an example of a Hessian regiment from Knyphausen. For example, German soldiers were either clean-shaven or they wore neatly groomed mustache, as you can see here on this image. Many of the Americans, in contrast, were unshaven, thus giving them an appearance of what one Hessian called a Spitzbube, or scoundrel, rather than soldiers. Shortly after his arrival on Long Island, a Hessian was embarrassed to write, he wrote in a letter to Kassel, that he did not have a razor. He was embarrassed that at times he had, quote, a beard like a rebel. Moreover, the Hessian troops, well uniformed, at least during the early phase of the war, found that many Americans were dressed in, quote, torn rags of different colors or the miserable outfits typically worn by poor farmers. For the most part, moreover, they found that American soldiers were also undisciplined and lacked loyalties. They were cowards who ran at the first sight of the enemy. From the Germans' perspective, Washington's retreats, in other words, his refusal to meet the British in a large-scale battle, were not based on strategic decisions. Rather, they were due to the spinelessness of his soldiers. Some officers contemptuously compared the war to a hunt. According to Chaplain Becker of the Hessian Corps, the Hessians were charging after the, quote, countless bands as gypsies, as he described the American troops. And at the Battle of Harlem Heights in the fall of 1776, the American Colonel Joseph Reed was enraged when British and Hessians, quote, sounded their bugles in a most insulting manner, as is usual after a fox chase. One exception to this unflattering view of the American military were the riflemen, but even these troops were regarded with ambivalence. While most Germans feared and respected these sharpshooters, their effectiveness as soldiers was limited in part by the time it took them to reload their weapons. In addition, they only really posed a threat in surroundings such as woods, where they could hide behind trees like hunters. The strategy, or their strategy, of ambushing an unsuspecting enemy may have been effective, but it was also seen as dishonorable. In 1777, a private wrote to his parents in Hessen that the Americans were not like regular soldiers at all, but rather, quote, more like robbers and thieves, in that they hide in hedges and bushes and shoot so well when they are able that they hit every time. I should mention, some of you probably know this, the German counterpart of the riflemen were the Jäger. Hunters, recruited from hunters and gamekeepers in Germany, they turned out to be particularly effective in the American war. So in general then, at least in the first couple of campaigns, in the beginning of the war, the Hessians regarded the Americans as an inexperienced, undisciplined, and poorly equipped enemy they were chasing most of the time. As one officer put it, it was fortunate that they were fighting against a nation that was unfamiliar, as he put it, with real warfare. It took the Germans a while to abandon their preconceived notions about the proper appearance and behavior of an army. These Germans, these thousands of Germans and civilians that went with the auxiliary forces, created a huge volume of records, public and private, diaries, letters, journals, official records, muster rolls, etc., etc. And my study is based largely on this archival material. So I would like to spend the rest of the time to show you a couple of representative samples of these kinds of sources and share stories surrounding them as a way to highlight a few of the experiences of these troops. I want to start with a private letter that was written by a lieutenant, a Braunschweig lieutenant, his name is Auguste Duroy, who was in Canada in May of 1781. The letter is here on the left. He wrote this letter to his sister Concordia in Braunschweig. When he sat down to write this letter, he had been in America for 5 long years. On the right here is a detail from a map of the St. Lawrence River, roughly from Quebec to Montreal. That's where the German troops that were in Canada, some for the entire war, some never saw battle, that's pretty much where they were encamped. Duroy himself was in this place that I circled there red. So this is where he is, he's writing this letter. His initial impressions of the land of Canada, really Quebec, had been quite positive. In fact, he described Canada in another record as a kind of simple world, a wilderness, mostly untouched by what he called civilization. He felt at one point as though he was seeing, quote, nature in her first childhood. But by 1781, his view had become less favorable. It is clear that he is lonely. And I should say that feelings of loneliness and homesickness are recurrent themes in these kind of records. Life in Canada in particular is harsh. He feels isolated. He doesn't even really know what's going on in the rest of the continent, especially during the winter. He misses his siblings. The last letter from Concordia had arrived in Canada 2 years earlier. At that time, Duroy was one of at least 5,000 German troops that were stationed in Canada, far more than British troops that were there at the time. Although they were in a loyal province, they were quite suspicious of the local sentiments, and they tended to feel like an occupying force. The fact that most of the inhabitants were French-speaking and Catholic may have contributed to their sense of alienation. Duroy actually, in the letter he writes this, he doubts that the Americans would dare another attack on Canada after the disastrous attempt in the winter of 75-76. But he can't be sure. By the time he writes the letter, of course, France had entered the war. That's a real threat. He knows, too, that the Americans at some point were just thinking about maybe we should go make another attempt on Canada. So I'm pointing this out because I think when we study the war or we study these events of the past, there's a temptation to sort of, of course, what happened. We know the Americans never attacked. In fact, we know that none of these troops ever participated in a battle in Canada. But they don't know that. So they had to remain on high alert. They were worried that an invasion might, in fact, come. Despite persistent complaints that you hear in many letters coming out of Canada, about the climate, the sense of isolation, the loneliness, the German troops, again, some spent years there, like Duroy, gradually got used to life in this northernmost province. When it came time for them to leave Canada in the summer of 1783, as many as 700 German soldiers belonging to the Braunschweig Corps were granted permission to remain there. So while thousands of German troops were stationed in Canada, largely inactive, a significant number of Germans were prisoners of war. And that takes me to the next record. Captivity was a common experience for members of the German auxiliary troops. Many spent considerable periods of time in captivity, mostly in locations from Massachusetts to Virginia. The record that I'm showing here is an embarkation list. It lists the troops belonging to 2 Hessian regiments, most of whom had been captured at Trenton in the fall of 1776. Now, this record is from 1779. These troops had been released, and they are now embarking on several vessels from New York to Canada. Over the course of the war, a total of at least 6,000 Germans were captured on 5 occasions alone. Many more were captured, but 6,000 we know they were captured at these 5 moments. Trenton, 1776, of course, more than 1,000 were taken. Then Bennington in 1777, Saratoga in 1777, Yorktown in 1781, and then 2 of these vessels. What happened is that the vessels departed, almost immediately sailed into a massive storm. Troop movements by boat, by the way, is something that the British more or less had to rely on, and it was a major disadvantage. So if they wanted to, whether they wanted to go to Philadelphia or to Canada or Florida or the southern colonies, they did this on boats going along the coast. Well, what does that mean? Well, first of all, it means that it confined sometimes thousands of troops on vessels, 2 vessels, for extended periods of time, making them unavailable for any kind of defensive or offensive actions. Ocean journeys also took a toll on the soldiers, who often arrived at their destination tired, hungry, and sick. On every voyage, moreover, soldiers were lost to disease or accident. In addition, the ships carrying troops were easy prey, especially if they were separated from the fleet, which happened quite frequently. On more than one occasion, the British lost transports to American and also later French capers. And the most spectacular of this kind involving German troops is this event. So these transports are leaving New York to Canada. There are 6 vessels. 3 of them I want to point out. One is the Adamant. The Adamant, unfortunately, was lost in the storm. There was, in the diaries and letters from members of the Corps, frequently expressions of hope that maybe they had been blown ashore somewhere, maybe they're in Europe, who knows, they were rescued. Well, it ultimately turned out that the Adamant had sunk. At least 200 individuals on board, men, women, and children, perished. Other vessels were seriously damaged in the storm, amongst them the Mali and the Triton. And I'm going to show you this nice drawing here from Andrea Wiederhold's diary. It's sort of a before and after picture of the Triton. He was on that ship. So Wiederhold had been taken prisoner at Trenton. He's now free, wanting to go to Canada. And this is what happens. They were taken, captured by Americans, and returned to captivity. I actually want to show you this too. I couldn't resist. From Johannes Reuber's diary, who was also taken at Trenton, and who's of course featured in the exhibit here in the museum. This is Johannes Reuber's depiction of the Battle of Trenton. In case, I just want to explain that. He has a lot of drawings in his diary, and it's kind of nice. So 2.5 years after this event, these individuals returned to captivity. I also want to point out on this embarkation list, which we don't have a lot of records of this, but we have enough to indicate that there were women and children. You can see that women and children are listed. There are 38 women total and 24 children total on these vessels. So that's an interesting document for that reason alone, I think. So when they were captured, Andreas Wiederhold actually writes in his diary, I mean, the vessel is basically drifting like on the ocean, you know, and they're like, oh God, they're capers. Thank God we're being captured now, and kind of saved their life. And he does say in his diary, he writes, we were happy to be off these miserable ships and on God's earth, if America was God's earth. So while this is all happening during this time period, as most of you probably know, the British had already launched their campaign into the southern colonies, the rebellious colonies. Between 1778 and 1781, British troop transport departed from New York for the South, the Carolinas, Georgia, Virginia. On several occasions, each of them included Germans. Thousands of Germans served in the South. Hundreds of them occupied Savannah and Charleston, for example, well after the defeat at Yorktown. My next document takes us a little bit further south. It takes us to West Florida. On the left is a printed pamphlet. We have several printed records of the journey from New York to Pensacola, West Florida. West Florida there was East and West Florida at the time, had remained loyal to Britain as well. So it's another, like Canada, another loyal province. Those troops sailed down in late 1778, stopped over on Jamaica, and then arrived in Pensacola. The regiment that participated in this is the Waldeck, the entire Waldeck regiment. They had been on Staten Island in camp. They were, they were identified as Yugo with some British troops, maybe another 600 or so, under a British general, of course. You go to West Florida just to defend it from Spanish aggression, because the Spanish wanted West Florida back. The Waldeck Regiment in total consisted of approximately 770 individuals, including 35 women and 15 children. Those are the people that boarded those transports when they went down south. It was the only German regiment that was sent as far south and the only one that fought against the Spanish. It turned out to be a devastating mission. When the small fleet of transport sailed through the waters of the Gulf of Mexico on New Year's Day, 1779, the author of this pamphlet, essentially, his name is Henrik Heldring, could hardly believe it. 3 years previously, he wrote, in 1776, he had celebrated a joyous New Year's in Flanders, Europe. Exactly 1 year later, in 77, he had found himself in winter quarters on another continent in New Jersey, having a grand time. A few days after that, unfortunately, he was captured by the Americans. When 77 turned into 78, he was terribly ill, still a prisoner of war. And here he was now, January 1st, 1779, after another year had gone by. He was healthy, he was free, and he was sailing toward Pensacola. As he wrote, "Who would have believed years ago that I would be wandering around this part of the world?" And what a world it was. In January, the troops arrived in Pensacola, a town numbering no more than maybe 200 or so buildings. Much of it had been destroyed by a hurricane a few months earlier. Though small, it was the seat of the provincial government and an important trading post that boasted the best port in the Gulf. The Spanish called it the arrogant guardian of the Gulf of Mexico, that offered the English, quote, "the best refuge they have for their ships and the key to these seas." Spain was eager to get it back. Within weeks of arriving in Pensacola, the Germans were wondering what they were doing in this remote part of the world. It was nothing but a desert, as they said, inhabited what they described as savages. The term Germans used at the time is Wilde, Native Americans. Why were they being sacrificed when they could be used somewhere else in North America? Why would Britain care about what they called the Siberia of America, which is an ironic term for Florida? The regiment suffered terribly from disease. Many men deserted eventually or were captured. Only a handful actually died in combat, which was common during the war overall. Greatest killer is disease. In the meantime, Spanish forces were moving in against British outposts along the Mississippi, north of New Orleans. German troops were dispatched from Pensacola to assist in their defense. However, the Spanish took one British fort after another, virtually unstoppable. In May 1781, Pensacola surrendered to Spanish forces and West Florida was lost. By that time, disease, desertion, and captivity had reduced the Waldeck Regiment to about approximately 250 soldiers. Remember, they had left more than 770. The Hessian officer Johann Ewald, a Jäger, who was in South Carolina at the time, learned about their fate a little shortly after that. An entry in his diary captured the sense of grief about the loss of so many of his compatriots in what seemed to him to be among the remotest places of the world. As he put it, how German bones are scattered around in this war. The prisoners that had been captured before the surrender of Pensacola were first held in New Orleans before being taken to Mexico and then to Havana, Cuba. Many died of disease there, others deserted, many of them probably went into Spanish service, some undoubtedly settled in Cuba, Florida, or Louisiana. The troops that had surrendered at Pensacola were sent to New York under the treaty with Spain on Spanish vessels. The last person on one of the embarkation lists was identified as a black woman. Like the other women with the Waldeckers, she remained unnamed. Most likely, she was employed by the regiment as an individual or an individual officer as a servant. However, the records do not reveal anything about her other than that she was black and that she was free. And this brings me to my final records. On the left, you see Braunschweig Garrison Church records, dated 1787. It documents the baptism of 5 black drummers who accompanied the German troops to Germany at the conclusion of the war. The baptisms were sponsored by officers that were veterans of the war, including General Adolf von Wiedesel, who commanded the Braunschweig Corps in North America. The register notes that the baptism and confirmation attracted an unusually large crowd. The record also notes that 4 of the 5 men were born in America and 1 was born in Africa. For the duration of the war, German military units in America actively recruited black men as musicians, laborers, servants, and in rare instances also privates. Black men and women also served the regiment in less formal roles, including personal servants, laborers, and cooks. On the right here, you see a muster roll of a Hanau artillery company that is in Brooklyn at the time in 1781. Note, and this is an unusual document because usually it's hard to identify black members of the Corps. In this particular case, they are clearly identified in the record as black. We have here 1 servant and 3 drummers. The commander of this particular company was Georg Peusch. He wrote a journal. He's an interesting guy. He survived the war. He was a part of the Convention Army and later released and was asked by the Hanau hereditary prince, his ruler, to send an account of the troops in America. And he was extremely frustrated because, after Saratoga, when many of these troops were captured, he really had no idea where they were in North America. He actually called what we know as the Convention Army, he called it the Confusion Army. It was so confusing. And here you have like 14 people. That's it. This company, it's tiny. So anyway, what he did, though, is in the summer, right around the time that this was completed, he wrote a letter to his ruler in Hanau, really excited about announcing that almost all of the Hessian regiments had hired black men for various roles, including especially musicians and laborers. In a letter to his ruler, he enthusiastically described the special uniforms that he had designed for these black tambours. This is not a Hanau regiment, but it's representative of the ways that these black drummers were dressed. The way he put it, he planned it all out. They would wear red hats decorated with white and blue bands, intertwined feathers, silver buttons. Their collars were bright red with silver braids. They were clad in white pants and short linen coats. This was entirely consistent with contemporary European views of blacks in European military units. Peusch believed that the addition of black musicians outfitted in exotic uniforms added considerable prestige to the Hanau companies. It is challenging to determine whether blacks ended up with German regiments as voluntary recruits or as plunder. The army routinely seized enslaved people during foraging expeditions, and we have written evidence that black children were sent to Germany during the war, often as gifts. Moreover, some of them eventually deserted, or they were returned to individuals who claimed them as their property. Nevertheless, whether they were attached to German military units voluntarily or involuntarily, whether in formal or informal roles, from the beginning of the German corps present in America, black women, men, and children were a familiar presence in their encampments. And at least 200 of them, I think more, there needs to be more research done on this, at least 200 of them traveled with the German corps to Germany when the British evacuated the new nation in 1783. So how does all of this broaden our understanding of the American Revolutionary War? I suggest that an examination of this rich body of German-authored records offers a fresh perspective of the American land, the people, the war, as seen and experienced by these participants and outsiders. It forces us to move beyond the themes and geographic regions that have traditionally been emphasized in narratives of the conflict, or focus on the Germans' experiences, for example, pulls in regions, geographic regions, that tend to be treated as peripheral to the war, such as Canada and West Florida. It offers, moreover, a fresh and I think quite insightful perspective of the American land, the people, customs, and manners. It also provides us with new interpretations of the American and British military and civilian leadership, including the suspected motives of the American rebels. It provides, finally, impressions and assessments of the Americans generally, and of course of the war, a war that was unlike any other military conflict they had known in Europe. In the words of one Hessian officer, it was, quote, a war that went against all humanity. Thank you. Some time?
Yes. I think we have a little time for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Baer. We'll be happy to take a couple questions. And anyone who has joined us here in person, of course, can get a book, ask a question afterwards. So we'll just take a couple questions in the room. We had, I think, a record number of Zoom questions for this program, so it's really exciting to see so many people tuning in from all over, a lot of German surnames for whatever that is worth. But I might consolidate a couple of them. There's a lot of interest in Hessians who stayed in America. And I might just ask you about two examples people asked about. Were there camp followers and civilians who stayed after the armies departed? And can you speak to the service of Hessian officers who left and joined provincial forces, people who served in loyalist regiments?
This is on? This is working, yes? Okay, yeah, thanks for those questions. So in terms of, we estimate that between 5,000 and 6,000 or so of these auxiliaries remained or settled in North America. They did not go back to Europe at the conclusion of the war. Maybe half of them actually did not stay in the United States. They went to Canada. Britain offered them with land grants, especially in Nova Scotia. So I think we often get this sort of, one of the questions that I often get is like, didn't they all stay in America? The short answer is no. The vast majority of the survivors actually went back to Germany. There's many reasons why staying here would not have been particularly attractive to a member of the Corps. In terms of, the question was specifically camp followers. If camp followers stayed here, yeah, I mean, I think that women stayed here. It was probably easier for women to stay here in some cases than for soldiers to stay here. What we have to remember too is that some territories right out prohibited their soldiers just from staying here, needed permission to do that. So one way to get around this, of course, was desertion, and that's risky. So if you were a civilian employee of the Corps, it was probably easier to get permission. That we have records of chaplains, physicians, especially civilian employees families who were in captivity and who had already lived in American communities for a while and maybe even established like a medical practice, for example. When they saw an opportunity to stay, they did stay. The other question about basically, if I understand you correctly, German soldiers joining the Americans.
Yeah, I think actually they were especially interested in German soldiers who joined provincial forces. This is from Todd Braystead, gave the example of Ludwig Keenan of the Regiment de Angeli, who served first with the Hessians and then with South Carolina Loyalist forces, if you know anything about them.
I mean, I can't speak to specific individuals, but I would say that one thing, so we know, of course, that some Germans essentially switched sides. They came over here and for whatever reason they were recruited into American regiments. I think in my book I write about this. The Congress, the Board of War, George Washington, who were, as you can probably imagine, not initially particularly excited about enlisting deserters, enemy soldiers. I mean, this is risky, obviously. So the efforts to, or the permission even by these deserters to join provincial regiments, I think in the beginning was inconsistent. There was no clear policy. That changed after Yorktown in particular. When a number of regiments were essentially received permission to actively recruit Germans, especially from amongst prisoner of war populations.
Thank you. We'd be happy to take a question from the room. Just raise your hand. There's one. I'll walk over. Just hold on a second.
Thank you. I'm just curious. I know that Ansbach and Bayreuth were only joined fairly soon before the American Revolution. Did those guys, did they consider themselves like from different states or something? Or did they just consider that they had one prince and they were then his guys?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're usually considered to belong together, so to speak. But there's two separate regiments. So to what extent, like the natives of Bayreuth or natives of Ansbach really saw themselves as being of one territory, I'm not sure. But in the war, and when they refer to and when we see records relating to them, they're usually considered to be together.
Thank you. As is our tradition, we will give the House the final question. So I'm going to offer that to Dr. Philip Mead.
Thank you, Tyler. You talked a lot about the anxieties that the princes and the Landgraves had about sending their troops to America out of Europe, but also the temptations of the income. What were the, say, middle and long-term effects of these choices for the German principalities? Was it destabilizing? Was it enhancing of their income, their development? Was this depopulation a significant problem? What does this tell us about German history?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it was a big moneymaker, and so, but it is complicated. So the subsidy payments did help finance projects in most territories that were, I would say, benefited the territory generally. And a great example of this are the spas in Hanau that were built with subsidy payments. There's a huge construction project, essentially, that employed a lot of locals and then becomes a tourist destination, basically. So the economic impact longer term were favorable. Some of these territories were able to pay down debt and sort of pull back from the verge of bankruptcy. Now, there were also, I mean, war is good for business, right? And I really mean that when you see these records and you see how many businesses or merchants supplied these troops. I mean, this is an incredible amount of stuff that they need. So we have the people, but we have the weapons and the uniforms and the prayer books and the paper that they write on and the food and all of that kind of stuff. And there is a huge number of businesses involved. They're all profiting, essentially. Now, when you go more into the rural areas, the country where the men actually were recruited from, there you see an increase, I would say, of poverty and real suffering. And that's something also in the archives we see. There's a lot of files of local officials essentially, writing to their rulers like, I have all these families. This woman has 5 children and the man is in America. And this woman relies on her son who was going to take over the business and he's in America, and they are impoverished. So in that regard, there are certainly regions in these territories that were really hurt by sending so many young men abroad. So I would say it's mixed. And the one final point, and some of you might know this, I'm sure, but the subsidy treaties were controversial. I mean, just because this has been practiced for 100 years or so, again, it's new that they're going to another continent, and the British opposition particularly is very upset about this. For them, it's on top of that a civil war. I mean, they're sent to America to fight against British subjects. So this is the first time that we have serious criticism of this kind of arrangement. In Britain and also continental Europe, there's some very well-known philosophers like Mirabeau, Voltaire, the King of Prussia. They're all critical of doing this kind of stuff. It's hard to reconcile with sort of this emerging sense of nationalism, to send your subject to fight in a foreign war. Germans hired out troops for a few more decades to other countries, but by the second decade or so of the 19th century, it's basically over. It doesn't happen anymore.
Just a quick follow-up to that. Does it change? There's so much conversation about what is liberty in these documents, it seems to me. And that's sort of striking from American historiography, which has long looked at, as you point out in the book, these troops as the sort of symbols of the opposite of that. And I just wondered, did these accounts that get published throughout Germany change the trajectory of the Enlightenment in Germany, of liberty conversation, is there a different response to what's coming in the French Revolution that might be explained by this? Big question, sorry.
It's a big question. Yeah, it changed the trajectory of the Enlightenment. I would say that when you read journals or the famous poets from the time, they're all sympathetic to the American, for the most part. They're sympathetic to the American cause. They like this, they like the idea of liberty, and these are fighting for their liberty, and they also admired Britain, by which, in comparison to Germany, had, for example, freedom of the press and other liberties that most German states did not have. So there's sympathy in that sense. I would say that the entry of the German troops complicates this. So you have, for example, I referenced early on the Deutsche Chronik, the German Chronicle. The editor was a big fan of the American Revolutionary Movement until the Germans were hired to put it down. At that point, he's like, what should I wish for? That the Americans win? That they defeat these German soldiers? Or should I hope for my fellow Germans to win? So it really presents a little bit of a dilemma for them. But I would say the general view, and at least if you consider that representative, in written journals, is sympathetic to the cause of liberty.
Thank you so much, Professor Baer. It's a terrific book.
Thank you so much.
I hope you all get a chance to read it. Thank you.
Thank you for.